It was the summer of 1914. There was excitement in the capitals of Europe. The streets were decorated with flags. Young men were being drafted into the army, and most were going proudly. "We'll be back before Christmas," they said. They waved goodbye to their families and loved ones at the train stations. No one could have known what hell awaited them. In London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, millions of young men put on their uniforms. Some were barely 18. Some had lied about their age to enlist. They wanted adventure. They wanted heroism. But what they would find was the most brutal industrial slaughter modern history had ever seen. World War I was the first total war humanity had ever seen. Machine guns, poison gas, flamethrowers, and heavy artillery were used on this scale for the first time. For the first time, it was industrial capacity, not military strategy, that determined victory. And for the first time, an entire generation faced the threat of total annihilation. On the Western Front, British and French forces on one side, the German Empire on the other. Between them, a 5-mile-long system of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And between these trenches, a region that belonged to no one, where no one could live, no man's land. It meant no one's land. Its width varied from just 30 meters to a kilometer. It was a death zone filled with barbed wire, shell craters, and corpses. This would become the symbol of modern warfare. This was the labyrinth where hundreds of thousands of soldiers would disappear, never to be found again. The real shock for young soldiers arriving at the front came when they first saw the trenches. Propaganda posters had painted grand scenes of battle in their minds. But the reality was very different. The trenches were narrow, deep corridors dug into the earth. Most were filled with mud. When it rained, they would sometimes fill with water up to waist level. Soldiers would remain in this mud for days, even weeks. Their feet would rot, and they would contract a disease called trench foot. Some would develop gangrene in their feet and have to have them amputated. There were rats in the trenches, giant rats that gnawed on human flesh. They would run across your face in the darkness of night. They would do anything to steal bread. Soldiers would sometimes try to kill them for fun, but the number of rats never decreased, because there was plenty to eat in no man's land. They also had to get used to the lice and fleas. They covered their bodies. They itched day and night. They couldn't sleep. Their uniforms got dirty, and there was no time to change them. Sometimes they couldn't wash for weeks. Diseases spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, cholera. But the worst part was the waiting. Sitting for hours, days, waiting. Not knowing when a shell would land next to you. Not being able to predict when a sniper would fire. Death at any moment, but also a freezing monotony. An English soldier wrote to his mother, "Mum, it's not like you think. There's no war here. Just mud, waiting, and death. My friends are dwindling every day. James, who was beside me yesterday morning, was gone by noon. A shell. It happened so fast he couldn't even say his last words." Another French soldier. "We were human before we went into the trenches. Now, I don't know, maybe we're worse than animals. At least animals know why they die." Taking the first step into no man's land was like walking to your death. But orders were orders. When the whistle blew, you would climb over the edge of the trench and run. Forward, toward the enemy lines. The 1st of July, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Britain was about to experience its bloodiest day in history. At 7:30 inches the morning, the whistles blew. Over 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of the trenches and began running toward no man's land. The German machine guns immediately opened fire. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Death machines capable of firing 600 rounds in a minute. Soldiers began falling to the ground, one after another. Some were hit with their first step. Some got caught in barbed wire, hung there, struggling helplessly, until they died. In a single day, 19,240 British soldiers died. 19,240. And more than 38,000 were wounded. Some bodies were found, but thousands more were lost in that muddy field. You can see it in the photos taken after the war. No Man's Land was a completely changed landscape. Every square meter had been bombed. There were no trees left standing, no grass. Only craters, puddles of water in the craters, and mud, deep, sticky, all-consuming mud. For the wounded, the mud was the greatest fear. If you couldn't move, if your wound was severe, you sank into the mud, slowly. Your friends tried to help you, but most of the time it was impossible. You were under enemy fire, and you, screaming, were sinking into the mud. Some would remain there in the mud for days, until they died. Their screams could be heard in the trench, but no one could help. This is exactly what happened at the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. The rains were so heavy that the area turned completely into a swamp. Thousands of soldiers drowned in the mud, literally drowned. The front line turned into a death swamp. As the war continued, a reality began to emerge. Thousands of soldiers were disappearing, completely, without a trace. The category missing began to appear frequently in official reports. MIA, missing in action, lost in battle. No body found, no witnesses, just missing. There were many reasons for this. The first was artillery fire. Heavy artillery was the deadliest weapon used at the time. A large caliber shell could completely obliterate a person. It could vaporize them. Nothing would remain. No bones, no flesh, no pieces of clothing, only mud and blood. It is estimated that 1.5 billion artillery shells were fired during the war on the Western Front. 1.5 billion. Each one was an opportunity for death. Each one was a chance to add someone to the list of missing persons. Second, there was the mud. We mentioned it earlier. But it wasn't just a matter of drowning. Bodies were also buried in the mud. Sometimes an artillery shell would launch a body meters away, burying it again. Sometimes, when new trenches were dug, they were dug over old bodies. Layer upon layer, the dead were piled on top of each other. Third, there was the difficulty of identification. At that time, fingerprinting was not widely used. DNA testing was unimaginable. Soldiers carried only metal dog tags. But when a shell fell, that tag could be destroyed, or it could be lost in the mud. Fourth, there was the intensity of the fighting. Sometimes the attacks were so intense that there was no time to collect the bodies. Bodies would remain in no man's land for days, even weeks. They would rot in the sun. Rats would gnaw on them. Eventually, they would become unrecognizable. And fifth, the most tragic. Sometimes, the bodies remained in enemy territory. It was impossible to reach them. You couldn't go there until the ceasefire. But by then, everything had already been destroyed. For those lost on the front lines, the war was over. But for those left behind at home, the real pain began then. A telegram would arrive. Dear Mr. Mrs. X, we regret to inform you that your son, husband Y, was lost in action on Z date. The government offers its deepest condolences on behalf of His Majesty. Missing. Neither dead nor alive, just missing. Mothers, wives, children. They all clung to the same hopeless hope. Maybe he's alive. Maybe he was taken prisoner. Maybe he was in a hospital, his memory lost. Maybe one day there would be a knock at the door, and he would return. Letters were written to the Red Cross. Lists were sent to prisoner camps. Do you recognize any of these names? The answers were usually negative, but hope did not die easily. In England, France, Germany, thousands of women waited for years for their husbands, sons, or lovers to return. Some did not mourn, because there was no certainty of death. There was only uncertainty, and this uncertainty was the most painful thing. In the 1,920 seconds, pilgrimage tourism began. After the war, thousands of mothers and wives went to France and Belgium. They visited the old battlefields. The reason was simple. Maybe we'll find a clue. Maybe we'll find out where he is. They walked through muddy fields. They wandered through cemeteries. There were thousands of crosses, most of them unmarked. They read unknown soldier. Which one was his? They couldn't know any of them. From an English woman's diary. Today I visited the cemetery near Albert. There were 2,340 graves. 1,800 of them were unmarked. Could William be one of them? I stood in front of every cross. I imagined him at each one. But he wasn't at any of them. He was nowhere. The 11th of November, 1918. The war was over. An armistice was declared. The guns fell silent, but no man's land was still littered with the dead. One of the largest operations that began after the war was the collection of bodies. Special teams were formed. They were called grave registration units. Their task was to comb through the old battlefields, find the bodies, identify them if possible, and bury them properly. This work was unimaginably difficult. The bodies had been buried for 4 years. Most were decomposed and disintegrated. The bones were mixed together. Without an identification tag, identification was impossible. This work continued for years. It continued even in the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds. Dozens of bodies were found every day. Some were identified, and their families were notified. But most were buried as unknown soldiers. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission was established for this task. Even today, they manage hundreds of war cemeteries in France and Belgium. Perfectly arranged. White stones, green grass, a cross or a gravestone in front of each grave. The known ones have names. For the unknown, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. But there were also those who could not be buried, those who were never found. For them, memorials were erected. Thiepval Memorial. It stands atop a hill in France's Somme region, a massive, imposing structure that seems to defy the sky. Designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, it was opened in 1932. There are no graves or funerals at this memorial, only names. The names of 72,337 British and South African soldiers. The name of every soldier who died in the Battle of the Somme and whose body was never found is written here, carved into panels, engraved for eternity. Every year, thousands of people come here. They search for the names of their great-grandfathers. Their fingers trace the panels. Here it is. It was here. They take photos. They cry. Then they leave. The Menin Gate is in Ypres, Belgium. It is even more impressive. 54,896 names, all Commonwealth soldiers lost in the Ypres region. The walls of the memorial are covered with names from top to bottom. Every evening, for 100 years, at exactly 8 p.m., a ceremony is held under the Menin Gate. The last post is played on the trumpet. Traffic stops. People listen quietly. A minute of silence. For those who were lost. For those who never returned. This ceremony has been held every day since 1928. Even during World War II, it only stopped when Ypres was under Nazi occupation. The day Ypres was liberated, the ceremony resumed that very evening. The Vimy Ridge Memorial is Canada's memorial. The names of 11,285 Canadian soldiers are inscribed on it. All of them are missing. 2 massive white pillars reach toward the sky. There are sculptures on them, figures mourning, suffering. At Verdun, there is the Douaumont ossuary. Inside, the bones of 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers lie mixed together, gathered together in one room. Enemy and friend, united in death. It has been 100 years since the war ended, but no man's land still reveals its secrets. Today, the areas stretching along the Western Front, between France and Belgium, are mostly farmland. Wheat, corn, and sugar beets are grown there, but every spring, when the plows turn the soil, remnants of the war surface. Farmers call it the iron harvest. Every year, tons of war material come out of the ground. Bullets, bombs, grenades,
barbed wire, crates, weapons, and sometimes human bones. Some villages have special collection points. Farmers bring their finds here. Bomb disposal teams come and safely neutralize them. But every year, people still die from explosions. Even a century later, the war continues to kill. When bones are found, police and military officials are called. Anthropologists come. An investigation is conducted. If an ID tag or other identifier is found, that's great. DNA testing is now possible. Sometimes, the family can be located, and 100 years later, a soldier can be given a proper burial. In 2019, an Australian soldier was found. He had been missing since 1917. A DNA test was performed. His grandchildren were located. After 102 years, he was buried with a ceremony, next to his family. But most of the time, the identity cannot be determined. Then, as the unknown soldier, he is buried with a military ceremony, and the lists of those without graves become a little shorter. 1,920. England, France, America. They all decided to implement the same idea, the tomb of the unknown soldier. The idea was simple, but impressive. A soldier's body, unidentified on the battlefield, would be brought back, and it would be buried with the highest honors in the most solemn ceremony. This body would represent all the fallen. It would symbolize every unmarked grave, every missing soldier. In England, on the 11th of November 1920, the unknown soldier was buried in Westminster Abbey. King George V and all the state dignitaries attended the ceremony. The body, wrapped in flags, lay in a special coffin. Soil was thrown on top of it, but this soil had been brought from France, from the battlefields. A black marble plaque was placed on the grave. It read, "Beneath this stone rests the body of a British warrior, unknown by name or rank, brought from France to lie among the most illustrious of the land. Beneath this stone lies an English warrior whose name and rank are unknown, brought from France to lie among the most illustrious of the land." In Paris, the French unknown soldier was buried beneath the Arc de Triomphe. A flame was lit on top. Flamme du souvenir, the flame of remembrance. This flame has never been extinguished since 1923. Every evening, a ceremony is held, and the flame is relit. In America, at Arlington National Cemetery. In the Soviet Union, in Moscow's Red Square. In Italy, in Germany. Every country commemorated its own unknown soldier. These monuments were not just for one person, they were for millions, for those who never returned, those who could not be found, those who were forgotten. Wars end. Years pass, generations change, but the wounds never fully heal. Even today, stories are told in families. Your great-grandfather went missing in World War I. His body was never found. Children grow up hearing this story. A family member with no grave. Just a name, perhaps a photograph, and a loss. Some families have visited the memorials for generations. They show their children their great-grandfather's name. Look, here it is. He went to war from here and never returned. Every year, on November 11, Remembrance Day is celebrated in the countries of the former British Empire. Poppies are worn. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow. The famous poem begins. People observe 2 minutes of silence. All traffic stops. Train stations, airports, schools, workplaces, everywhere falls silent. And for 2 minutes, they remember the past. Because to forget is to kill them a second time. No Man's Land was a tactical error in warfare. Trench warfare killed hundreds of thousands of people in a war that could not be won. Thousands of lives were sacrificed for mere meters of land. Historians ask today, was it worth it? 20,000 dead in a single day at the Somme for a few hundred meters. Months of fighting at Passchendaele for a few kilometers of advance. 300,000 dead at Verdun for a fortress. Was it worth it? For most, the answer is clear. No. War is the failure of politics. And World War I is the most tragic example of that failure. But soldiers did not make policy. They obeyed orders. Believing they were fighting for their country, they died bravely, some heroically, some pointlessly. But all of them were young. All of them had promising futures. And those who were lost, they are the most tragic victims of war, because their stories never ended. Their families searched for them for years. They had no graves, just a name on a monument. Today, if you visit the former no man's land, you will see green fields, a peaceful, tranquil rural landscape. Birds are singing, farmers are working. Life goes on as normal. Modern French countryside, drone footage. But if you look closely, you can see the traces. The slightly uneven patches of soil are the marks of old trenches. The spots where no trees grow and no grass sprouts are due to intense chemical contamination from the remnants of poisonous gases. Some areas are still marked as red zones. Entry is prohibited because there is so much unexploded ordnance in the soil that it is impossible to clear. These areas will remain dangerous for centuries. Zone Rouge, Red Zone. Approximately 1,200 square kilometers in France, around Verdun, Somme, Ypres. Here, there is still arsenic, lead, and mercury in the soil. Unexploded bombs, chemical weapon residues. In some areas, the acidity level is so high that nothing grows. And some villages have been completely destroyed, never to be rebuilt. They call these dead villages. There is only a sign at the entrance. This was once the village of X. It was completely destroyed in the war. Population 0. But the cemeteries are always well maintained. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission manages 23,000 military cemeteries and memorials today. Worldwide, 1.7 million graves. Each one is perfectly cared for. The grass is short, the stones are clean, the flowers are fresh. If we remember their names, they will never die, says the Commission's slogan. And indeed, even a century later, every name is remembered, every grave is honored. Statistics sometimes hide the truth. 700,000 missing soldiers. It's just a number. But each one was a person. Each had a story. Take Private John Parr, for example. British Army, 17 years old. The first British soldier to die in the war. On the 21st of August 1914, he was shot while on reconnaissance in Belgium. His grave is known. But when his mother heard of her son's death, she went mad. She was taken to hospital. She never recovered. Or Lieutenant Henri Desagneaux, a French officer. He fought at Verdun. He kept a diary. His last entry, the 22nd of August 1916. Tomorrow we attack. We all know. Most of us won't return. But we have to do it. For my friends, for my country. I wrote my last letter to my mother. I hope she never has to read it. The next day, Henri disappeared. His body was never found. His diary was found by a friend and sent to his mother. It was published years later. Private William McBride, Irish, 19 years old. Known as Willie McBride, died in 1916. He has a grave, but it was listed as unknown soldier for a long time. In the 1,990 seconds, an Irish musician, Eric Bogle, wrote a song for him. The Green Fields of France. The lyrics of the song consist of questions asked by a visitor at Willie's grave. Willie, did you hear about the war? Did you see the horror, the mud, the pain? Or did a bullet take you before you could see it? This song became famous worldwide. Willie McBride became a symbol of the lost soldier. What remains from the war are not just graves. There are photographs, letters, personal belongings. At the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres, thousands of items are on display inside. Soldiers' trunks, letters, photographs, personal belongings, pocket watches, lighters, razors. Objects from everyday life. But behind each one, there is a story. There is a pocket watch. Stopped. It shows 11:32. Its owner was a British sergeant. He died in 1917. The watch froze that moment. It stopped time. There is a letter, left unfinished. A German soldier was writing to his mother. His last sentence, "Mother, I'm not afraid anymore. I know what I have to do." There is no period at the end. The letter is unfinished. That soldier died before he could finish writing. There are photographs of families taken before they went to war. Young faces, hopeful gazes. Their uniforms are spotless, their posture proud. A few months later, most of them were dead or missing. There is one photo that is particularly famous. They were called the Pals Battalion, the Friends Battalion. The British would gather young men from the same town, the same factory, the same sports club, and enlist them together. The idea was good for morale. But the result was disastrous, because when those battalions went into battle, they could be completely wiped out in a single attack. All the young men from a town could die in a single day. At the Somme, some towns experienced exactly that. All the young men left. None returned. In one photograph, 30 young men from Sheffield, steelworkers. They all enlisted together in 1914. In the photo, they are smiling, hugging each other. In 1916, at the Somme, they all died. On the same day, the town lost a generation. War also inspired art. Poems were written, songs were composed, some at the front, some at home. Wilfred Owen, the war poet. He fought himself. He died himself just 1 week before the war ended, but his poems are the most powerful works depicting the true face of war. His poem, Dulce et decorum est, it is sweet and proper, describes a gas attack with horrific details. And it ends with, "If you had seen the nightmares I have seen, you would not tell children lies like, 'It is sweet to die for one's country.'" Siegfried Sassoon, another poet, he also fought at the front. His poems describe the absurdity of war and the suffering of soldiers. In one poem, he says, "Soldiers are not stupid. Commanders are stupid. They sit comfortably in their trenches, while we die in the mud." Songs were also written. Soldiers sang songs in the trenches, sometimes cheerful songs to lift their spirits, sometimes sad songs to remember their losses. Keep the home fires burning was very popular in England. For those who stayed at home, for those who waited. Sag mir wo die Blumen sind, Tell Me Where the Flowers Are, is a German song. It speaks of the senselessness of war, of the losses. And of course, It's a Long Way to Tipperary, the marching song of the British soldiers. Cheerful, hopeful. But most never made it to Tipperary, because the road passed through no man's land. For those returning from war, coming home did not mean the war was over, because the war continued in their minds. It was called shell shock, bullet shock. Today we call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then, no one understood it. Soldiers were returning home, but they had changed. They couldn't sleep at night. They had nightmares. They were afraid of sudden noises, explosions. Some couldn't speak. Some trembled constantly. Some showed violent tendencies. Families didn't understand. "He's changed. He's not the same anymore," they said, because he really had changed. War changes people, especially those who had witnessed the horror of the trenches, of no man's land. Thousands of soldiers were sent to mental hospitals. They were diagnosed with shell shock. Some underwent electroconvulsive therapy. Some were imprisoned because they were considered dangerous. Some committed suicide. Today we know that these were symptoms of trauma. The brain had seen so many horrific things that it could no longer function normally. It was constantly on alert, constantly expecting a threat. And worst of all, society was unsympathetic. "Be a man," they said. "Get over it," they said. But trauma cannot be overcome like that. It requires treatment. It requires support. It requires understanding. Those who died in the war were mostly men. But women also experienced the pain of war, perhaps even more so, because while the men went to the front, the women stayed at home. They looked after the children, they looked after the elderly, but at the same time, they also took on the men's jobs. They worked in factories, they worked in the fields. They produced ammunition, they harvested crops. In England, they were called munitionettes, women who worked in munitions factories. It was dangerous work. They handled chemicals. Explosions occurred. Some died in accidents. Some turned yellow from poisoning. They were called canary girls. Nurses went to the front. They worked in field hospitals. They saw the worst injuries, witnessed the most horrific deaths. Some died in bombings. Some caught diseases and died. Vera Brittain, an English nurse and writer, she lost her fiancé, her brother, and 2 close friends in the war. She wrote her memories in the book Testament of Youth. The book was written in memory of a lost generation. "We lost almost our entire generation," she wrote. "Young men died. Young women couldn't find anyone to marry. Unborn children were never born. A generation was completely wiped out. And those who waited. Mothers, wives, sisters, fiancés. They all waited. They wrote letters full of hope. They received letters full of fear. They flinched at every knock on the door. Could this be the bad news? When the telegram arrived, the world collapsed. For some, it never recovered. World War I did not only affect that period, it also affected subsequent generations. Millions of young men died. This meant millions of children were never born. A generation gap was created. In the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, women couldn't get married because there were no men left. They were called surplus women in England. Approximately 2 million women couldn't get married because there were no men to marry. And the children without fathers. Children born just before the war who never saw their fathers. They would ask their mothers, "What was my father like?" The mother would show an old photograph. "This is what he was like. He was strong, handsome, brave, and he loved you very much, even though he never saw you." These children grew up as children of the lost generation. When World War II began, they fought, and many of them died. 2 generations were lost in 2 wars. In some families, it became a tradition. Every generation visits the cemeteries on Armistice Day. They point out the names of their great-grandfathers. They tell their stories, to remember. Because if we forget, it could happen again. Technology has advanced. Things that were impossible a century ago are now possible. DNA testing has revolutionized the field. Now, identity can be determined from just a bone fragment. Family tree research, DNA databases. These make it possible to name missing soldiers. In recent years, dozens of soldiers have been identified. Their families have been contacted. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren attended the funerals of their great-great-grandfathers. A century later, a circle has been closed. In 2014, the 100th anniversary of World War I was commemorated. To mark the occasion, major projects were launched. The Fromelles Project is one of them. A major campaign was conducted in Australia. DNA samples were collected from families. And in France, near Fromelles, a mass grave was found. 250 soldiers. Each was carefully removed. DNA samples were taken. They were compared to the database. Result: 144 soldiers were identified. They gained names. Their names were engraved on gravestones. Families were notified. An Australian woman, aged 90, attended her great-uncle's funeral. "I never knew him," she said, "but I always knew he existed. He was always mentioned in family stories. Now, finally, he has come home." This is a gift of modern technology, an opportunity to bring justice to the past. We said that numbers sometimes hide the truth, but some numbers need to be known because they reveal the true cost of war. In World War I, a total of 70 million soldiers fought. Approximately 20 million of them died. 10 million soldiers, 10 million civilians, 21 million were wounded. Many lived with lifelong disabilities. On the Western Front alone, An estimated 6 million soldiers died. Of these, approximately 700,000 were never found. Missing, nameless, graveless. Britain lost 880,000 soldiers. Of these, 180,000 were missing. France lost 1.4 million soldiers. 300,000 were missing. Germany lost 2 million soldiers. 467,000 were missing. The financial cost? Incalculable. Billions of pounds, francs, marks were spent. Economies collapsed. Empires fell. Germany experienced hyperinflation. Russia had a revolution. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated. But the real cost cannot be measured in money. Lost potential, lost lives, lost futures. This is incalculable. Think about it. How many scientists could have been among those 20 million people who died? How many doctors? How many teachers? How many artists? How many fathers? How many husbands? How many sons? And how many children were never born? For generations, the world felt the impact of this loss. The war ended on the 11th of November, 1918. On the 11th day of the 11th month, at 11 a.m., an armistice was declared. The guns fell silent. Celebrations began in the cities. People poured into the streets. They cried, they laughed, they embraced. The war was over, finally. But at the front, there was silence. For the first time in 4 years, there was no sound of artillery, no sound of machine guns, only the wind and the birds. The soldiers were in shock. They had become accustomed to it. War had become normal. Now, what would they do? They returned home. But home was no longer the same, because they had changed. They had lived in the mud, on the brink of death, for 4 years. How could they return to normal life? Some couldn't. They failed. They became unemployed, homeless. They begged on the streets. Former soldiers, who had fought for their countries, were now forgotten. And in Paris, in 1919, the peace conference convened. The victorious nations reshaped the world. Borders were drawn. Countries were established. Reparations were determined. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June, 1919. Germany was blamed. Heavy reparations were imposed. Its territories were taken. Its army was restricted. Some historians say, this treaty sowed the seeds of World War II because Germany was humiliated, crushed, and a generation later, it took revenge. But that's another story. After the war, societies sought ways to commemorate their losses. In England, the cenotaph, the empty tomb monument, was erected in Whitehall, London. Every year, on November 11, a ceremony is held here. The royal family, the Prime Minister, and all state officials attend. 2 minutes of silence are observed at 11 a.m. The cenotaph bears the inscription, "The glorious dead," but they may not have wanted to die gloriously. They may have just wanted to live. In France, every village has a war memorial. It is called the Monument aux Morts. The names of every soldier from that village who went to war and did not return are written on it. In some small villages, there are 50 to 60 names. The entire young population of the village, every year, on November 11th and May 8th, for World War II, the villagers gather in front of this monument. They read the names. They lay wreaths. They remember. In Canada, Vimy Ridge is a national symbol. Canadians fought here for the first time as an independent army, and they won. But they suffered thousands of casualties. The monument is both a monument to victory and a monument to mourning. In Australia and New Zealand, Anzac Day is April 25th. It's the anniversary of the Gallipoli landing. That landing was a terrible failure. Thousands of Anzac soldiers died. But today, it has become a day of national identity, a day of courage, sacrifice, and friendship. War also affected art. Painters, sculptors, writers reflected this experience in their works. Otto Dix, German painter, he fought in the war and was wounded. Then he painted what he saw. Horrific, disturbing images. decaying corpses, mangled bodies, deranged soldiers. He never romanticized it, never embellished it. He showed the true face of war. Paul Nash, English painter. His painting, "We Are Making a New World," is famous, but it is ironic. Because in the painting, there is a completely devastated landscape. Trees are broken, the ground is bombed, everything is dead. Is this the new world? Katha Kollwitz, German sculptor. She lost her son in the war. She mourned for years. Finally, she made a sculpture. Mourning parents. Two figures, on their knees, bent over in grief. They were her and her husband. She placed the sculpture on her son's grave in Belgium. Today, that sculpture represents all parents who have lost children. A century has passed, but the wars haven't ended, and the losses continue. In Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, wars are everywhere. And in every war, there are missing soldiers. MIA. Missing in action. It's still a term in use. In the Vietnam War, more than 1,600 American soldiers are still missing. Families are still searching, still waiting for information. In the Balkan Wars, in the 1,992nd, more than 10,000 people are missing. Mass graves are still being found. Identities are still being determined. And terrorism has added a new dimension. The 1,100 people who disappeared on September 11th, their bodies were never found. They were completely obliterated in the collapse of the World Trade Center. Their families couldn't even build a grave. War changes, technology changes, but human suffering remains the same. The pain of losing a loved one was the same 100 years ago, and it's the same today. So, what have we learned? What have we learned from World War I, from No Man's Land, from the lost soldiers? Some say nothing, because wars continue. People are still dying. They continue to disappear. But perhaps we have become a little more sensitive. We understand a little more about the true cost of war, not just political goals, but human lives. The United Nations was founded as a result of 2 world wars. The idea was simple. If countries talk, maybe they won't fight. This system hasn't always worked, but it's better than nothing. The European Union was founded on a similar idea. France and Germany were enemies for centuries. They fought 3 major wars: 1,870, 1,914, 1,939. Millions died. Now, they have economic and political unions. There are no borders between them. Young people no longer see the other side as the enemy. This may be the legacy of the lost generations. They died, but perhaps their deaths brought peace to future generations. But it's not just the responsibility of governments and international organizations. We also have a responsibility to remember history, to learn, to pass it on, to tell our children and grandchildren, "Look, this happened. It was horrific. It must never happen again." But how? Empathy, trying to understand the other side. The enemy is also a human being. He is also someone's son, someone's father. He also wants to live. Dialogue, talking, listening, resolving differences through conversation, not with weapons. And never, ever romanticize war. War does not create heroes. Heroes emerge despite war. But war itself is only tragedy. World War II veterans are now very old, in their hundreds. We are losing them fast, but they all say the same thing. War is not what it seems. It is horrific. No one should ever experience it. The veterans of World War I are all dead now. The last one died in 2012. There are no eyewitnesses left. Only records, letters, and photographs remain. And it is our responsibility to remember them, to tell their stories, because they can no longer tell them themselves. No Man's Land is not just a term of war. It is also a metaphor, a land belonging to no one, an area that no one owns, that no one can control. Chaos, uncertainty, danger. Life itself is sometimes like no man's land, especially in difficult times. During pandemics, economic crises, personal tragedies, we find ourselves in no one's land. Neither forward nor backward, we just try to survive. But a lesson from World War I: you can survive. Even if it's hard, even if it hurts, you can survive. And eventually, you can leave that land behind. Soldiers crossed no man's land. Some died, but some made it through. And eventually, the war ended. Life went on. Today, that land is green, farmland. Children play, farmers work. Life triumphed over death. Perhaps the message is this: death is inevitable. There will be tragedy, but life will always find a way. It continues. And our duty is to honor that life, to remember the lives we lost, and to build a better world so that their suffering is not in vain. Every year, November 11 at 11 a.m., the world stops for 2 minutes. In London, buses stop, people stop in the streets, cafes, restaurants, offices, everywhere falls silent. In Paris, people gather in front of the cenotaph, heads bow. In Ottawa, Wellington, Canberra, in every Commonwealth country, at the same time, the same silence. 2 minutes. 120 seconds. But in those 120 seconds, millions of people think the same thing. The lost, those who never returned, the known and the unknown, those with graves and those without. And then the bugle sounds, the last post, the final watch, the soldier's last warning, but also a farewell. You can rest now, your duty is done. Rest in peace. Some people cry, some stand silently, some think of people they never knew, but all, at the same moment, unite. Because those losses are all of ours, humanity's loss. Before closing, let's read a real letter, from a real soldier, Private Albert Edward Wood, British Army, age 19. He went missing in 1918, in no man's land. He wrote to his mother the day before going to war. Dearest Mother, we're leaving tomorrow, to France. Everyone is very excited, but I'm a little scared, to be honest. But don't tell anyone, okay? Men shouldn't be scared. But I can tell you, because you're my mother, you always understand. If anything happens to me, and I hope it doesn't, but if it does, I want you to know that I loved you very much, and Dad too, and little Mary. I'm leaving something for her, that toy bear you gave me when I was a baby. Give it to her as my gift. And don't cry, dearest mother. If anything happens, I died for my country. You should be proud. Everyone says so anyway. But to tell you the truth, I just want to come home. I want to sit in the garden, eat your apple pie, hear Mary laugh. But duty is duty, and I will do my duty. Always with love. Albert disappeared 3 months later, in a morning attack. His body was never found. His name is written on panel 6A at the Thiepval Memorial. Just his name. His mother kept that letter until she died. Under her pillow, she read it every night, and she cried. Albert's story is just one of hundreds of thousands, but each one is the same pain, the same loss, the same future that never was. No man's land, no one's land, but in reality, everyone's land, because those buried there were people from every nation, every class, every faith. The war ended. 100 years have passed, but their legacy lives on. In the bones found each year, in the soldiers whose identities are confirmed each year, in the grandchildren who visit the memorials each year, in their families, in the stories told for generations. Our great-great-grandfathers were lost in the Great War. And most importantly, in remembering. Because to remember is to keep them alive. To remember is to honor their sacrifice. To remember is to teach future generations. We remember to say, war does this. It does this to people, to families, to communities, and it must never happen again. No man's land is now green fields. But the earth does not forget. Every spring, it brings its past to the surface, the bullets, the bombs, the bones. And we must not forget. Because if we forget, history repeats itself. They never returned, but they were never forgotten. And they will never be forgotten. Never. We will remember them.